This revision video covers Unit 2, Germany, and we're focusing on the first part of the Germany depth study and what challenges did Germany face 1919 to 1923. So the topic starts with the end of the First World War. You need to be aware that Germany expected to win this war, so it came as a shock when they didn't. Lots of returning soldiers came back to Germany, still armed, still with their weapons, and they were out on the streets, roaming round in big armed gangs. This caused lots of social problems. There were many economic problems as well because of high unemployment and inflation. Germany had expected to win, so was nearly bankrupt. Many people were actually starving, and due to the fact that the Kaiser had been forced to abdicate, they were trying to come up with a new political solution. So there was political and social chaos, and through all of this, the politicians were attempting to set up a new constitution. In January 1919, so only a couple of months after the end of the war, the communists, the Spartacists, attempted to take over Berlin. They did not want the democracy that the new politicians were attempting to set up. They wanted a communist Germany, and they wanted to copy what had happened in Russia. So they attempted to take over Berlin by force, by violence, armed men. They managed to take over some key buildings, and there was fighting in the streets and barricades, but they were eventually defeated by another armed group called the Freikorps, who were right-wing and who traditionally supported the Kaiser. Now, the Freikorps defeated the Spartacists because they were asked to by the government. The government couldn't rely on the army because the situation was just so chaotic, and they didn't know whether they could trust the army. So the communist attempt to take over Berlin fails, but it was a real threat to the new system. In June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is published. It's a diktat. It's dictated to Germany. They don't have any say in its contents, and they are told, sign it or you will be invaded and the war is likely to start again. Now, BRAT, B-R-A-T, helps you remember what was in it. So the B is for blame. Germany was blamed for starting the war. The War Guilt Clause, Clause 231. Many Germans thought this was morally unfair, and they didn't feel they were to blame for the war. But because they accepted blame, they had to pay reparations, R for reparations. That's compensation for all the damage caused. The amount wasn't set at Versailles, but was set later on, and it was £6,600 million, or £6.6 billion. This was a huge amount for a country already experiencing economic chaos, nearly bankrupt from the war, and they would really, really struggle to pay this amount. The A is for armed forces. Germany's armed forces were reduced. This was so they couldn't pose a threat again. So the army was reduced to 100,000 men. It had been over 1 million. The navy was reduced to 15,000 sailors and 6 battleships. No submarines allowed. No air force allowed. Conscription was banned. No motorised vehicles like tanks. The army was also not allowed in the Rhineland, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. The Germans thought this was unfair. No other country had been forced to reduce its armed forces. They felt defenceless. And finally, territorial changes, which we'll look at on a map. Germany lost all its colonies in its empire, and it also lost a lot of land within Europe. This meant that they lost all the valuable materials, the raw materials in these areas, which had an economic impact as well. As well as that, the people obviously found themselves living in foreign countries. So to sum up, it was hated by many, and there were huge, huge protests against it. If you look at this map here, you can see that Germany is split in two. You might need to look at your PowerPoint handout to see it in detail. But East Prussia is separated from the rest of Germany by the Polish corridor, because Poland is created. Over to the west, you can see the green Rhineland, that's demilitarized. You can see the yellow Saarland is given to the League of Nations to run for 15 years. That's full of coal reserves. That has a massive impact on the German economy. You can see that Alsace and Lorraine go back to France, and Eupen and Malmedy goes to Belgium. So the map of Germany is redrawn, and they lose lots of valuable resources. Now, in the summer of 1919, after the Treaty of Versailles, the Weimar Constitution is published. This is really democratic and really forward-looking. It's something totally different from the system under the Kaiser. First of all German people, men and women over the age of 20, can vote for members to go into the Reichstag, and also they can vote for the president directly every 7 years. So the two main roles within this new constitution are the president and the chancellor. So the red box shows the president. The president chose the chancellor, is head of the armed forces, and chose the judges. But he is not in control of day-to-day government. The biggest power that the president has is Article 48, which stated that in an emergency the president can make laws without asking the permission of the Reichstag. Now, this is supposed to be like a safety valve if anything goes wrong. Democracy stops and the president basically takes over. Now, that could be a potential problem depending on who the president is. Now, the president chooses the chancellor. The chancellor is normally the leader of the party that gets the most MPs or the most deputies in the Reichstag, and that's the German people voting for the Reichstag. Now, the votes are counted up using a system called proportional representation. Proportional representation means that lots of parties can get a representative into the Reichstag because they look at the percentage of the vote they have achieved and convert it into a number of seats. However, the big problem with that is that one party struggles to get a majority. If one party isn't in overall control of the Reichstag, whenever there's a vote on a law, it's hard to get it passed. So what happens is lots of coalition governments who have to cooperate and negotiate with each other, and this can cause problems. The Reichstag is like the House of Commons. The other house within the Houses of Parliament is the Reichsrat. And that is made up of representatives from each of the 18 local parliaments. So each region in Germany has a local parliament, and they send a representative from that to the Reichsrat. And that is a bit like the House of Lords. Now, the political situation was unstable and it was very dangerous. Many politicians were assassinated. Now, after the Treaty of Versailles had been announced, it was clear that the armed forces were going to have to be reduced. And the Freikorps, those right-wing armed men who had destroyed the Spartacists back in January 1919, they were told that they had to disband, they had to go home. Now, they decided in March 1920 that they weren't going to do that. And under the leadership of Dr. Kapp, they attempted a violent putsch, a revolution and attempted to take over Berlin. So this brings yet more chaos. However, in a sign that the people are prepared to listen to the new Weimar government, they follow the new government's orders to go on strike, and this brings Berlin to a standstill. All services are disrupted, and in the end, the Freikorps basically leave, they run away, and the putsch is a failure. So there's a glimmer of hope that the political situation might be beginning to stabilise. Things take a turn for the worst in January 1923. This is when the Weimar government is unable to pay an instalment of the reparations bill, and in response, French and Belgian troops enter the Ruhr area with the intention of taking over the factories and taking the goods out of them and sending them back to France and Belgium in order to sell them and get their money that way. Now, this causes lots of problems. There's a lot of hostility. When the French and the Belgian troops go in, it's like they're taking over the areas, and they start running them as extensions of their own home countries, and many Germans are expelled. In response, the German government orders the workers to go on passive resistance. They haven't got a huge army that can stand up to the French and the Belgian troops, so instead they stop working, which means when the French and Belgian troops go into the factories, there's nobody to work there, so they have to bring in their own workers. The problem with that is that it partly leads to hyperinflation. There has already been a massive issue with inflation, and printing money to pay the striking workers causes hyperinflation. You can see the children in the top picture there playing with bundles of money that are worthless. Now, the Ruhr area is full of raw materials that are sent all over Germany. So it's not just the economy in the Ruhr that is affected. The economy across Germany collapses due to lack of access to raw materials. That affects trade. Foreign countries no longer want to trade with Germany because they don't trust the currency, and this leads to shortages of goods, which leads to poverty. Many people were starving. They hadn't got access to basic food items or medicines. The middle classes lose their savings, they lose their businesses, they go bankrupt. And the Weimar government doesn't seem to be able to solve this situation. The spiral of hyperinflation keeps getting worse and worse. Some people with loans do benefit because they're able to pay loans and mortgages off quickly, and the super rich can buy out competitors. But overall, most people are really struggling. Now, taking a step backwards, the Nazi Party were in existence at this point. They'd been created as the German Workers' Party, the DAP, at the end of the First World War, and Hitler joined the group. At the beginning, he wasn't the leader, that was a man called Anton Drexler, but before long he becomes the leader. He changes the name and introduces National Socialist German Workers' Party, so the NSDAP, the Nazis, to widen its appeal. He introduces the swastika, so a symbol to make them instantly recognisable, and he sets up the brown shirts, the armed wing of the Nazi Party. He also sets out his 25-point plan, which contains most of their key ideas. If we're looking at their key ideas, nationalism, making the nation strong and powerful. Socialism, protecting workers' rights. Ensuring that big businesses are not too powerful and that society is organised to work for the government. Totalitarianism, one leader in total control. They believe in traditional German values. Struggle. So life is a struggle, and it's all about expanding the country. And racial purity. These were his beliefs on the Aryan race being superior. Now this links to hyperinflation because in 1923, in the November, he decides to take advantage of anger at the Munich, at hyperinflation, and he attempts a putsch as well. He believes they will have enough support to take over Munich and then march on Berlin and overthrow the new Weimar government. He has the support of General Ludendorff, who is a general from the army who was in charge during the First World War. Hitler and his stormtroopers go into a beer hall where the local Bavarian parliament were meeting, announces a revolution has begun, and states his aims and his intention to march on Munich. For whatever reason, the police and the authorities are informed of his intentions, and when they leave the beer hall attempting to march on Munich, there is a police unit waiting. There's a firefight in the street. Some Nazis are killed, some police are killed, and later on Hitler is arrested. So on the surface this putsch seems like a total failure, but he is put on trial, and throughout the court case his voice is heard, his ideas are heard in the courtroom, the press reports on it, and people find out about his ideas, so he gains publicity. And when he's in prison, he is able to write Mein Kampf and set out his ideas, and he makes the crucial decision that he cannot win power by using violence and a putsch and trying to take over illegally. He's going to win power democratically by winning elections. And that change in approach will be crucial later on. So hopefully you can see the problems that the early Weimar government faced.